The Côte d'Azur, in the last week of July, had committed itself entirely to excess. The sea was a particular shade of blue that no respectable Englishman could look at without faint suspicion, and the cicadas, having rehearsed all afternoon, were now performing with the confidence of professionals who expect no encore. Even the pines along the corniche had taken on that lacquered look peculiar to the south of France, as though someone had varnished them in preparation for a photograph. The Villa Mirabelle stood above the road, between Beaulieu and Villefranche, at the end of a white drive lined with oleanders. It was not the largest house on the promontory. That distinction belonged to a Russian prince, who had not been seen since 1917, but it was, by common consent of the neighborhood, the one most likely to contain either a quarrel or a diplomat, and sometimes both. That evening, it contained neither. It contained, instead, a party. Mrs. Celia Whitstable, who was English by birth and Provençal by conviction, had invited 17 people to dine on her terrace, and had been pleased to discover that 16 of them had accepted. The 17th, a Belgian cellist of modest gifts and catastrophic manners, had cabled his regrets from Monte Carlo. Mrs. Whitstable read the cable twice, folded it into a small and irritable square, and decided that 16 was, if anything, a rather more manageable number. "It is only," she observed to her niece, who was arranging tuberoses in a shallow bowl, "that I had seated him next to Madame d'Auvergne, and she will now be next to nobody at all. She will be next to Mr. Pryor, aunt. That is what I meant by nobody at all." Her niece, whose name was Alice Clavering and whose patience with her aunt had been cultivated over many years as one cultivates a rather difficult vine, permitted herself a small smile and said nothing. The tuberoses were being arranged for the benefit of a Miss Harding from Surrey, who was said to admire them, and Alice had not yet decided whether she admired Miss Harding. By 7, the guests had begun to assemble on the terrace. The terrace faced west, towards Cap Ferrat, and at that hour, each summer, the light performed the same small miracle. It turned the limestone pink, the sea a darker and more honest blue, and every woman present about 4 years younger than she had been at luncheon. Mrs. Whitstable, in a gown of pale grey silk that disguised a great deal and forgave what it could not disguise, moved among her guests with the practised sweetness of a hostess who has counted the champagne. There were, among the company, 3 persons whose presence would later acquire a significance they did not, at that moment, possess. The first was Sir Henry Pryor, a banker of 62, who had retired from the city with a knighthood and a liver of uncertain loyalty. He stood by the balustrade with a glass of vermouth he had not yet tasted, looking at the sea with the expression of a man who had paid for the view and was now inspecting its quality. The second was Madame Odile d'Auvergne, a widow of Lyons, whose husband had left her a silk business, and whose subsequent career had left her a reputation. She was perhaps 45, dressed in black, with a single emerald at her throat, and she laughed rather more often than the conversation warranted, as though laughter were a form of punctuation she had been advised to use. The third was a young man named Lawrence Fielding, who was introduced as a painter, and who possessed that particular quality, common among young men at seaside villas, of appearing to have been invited by someone other than the hostess. Mrs. Whitstable, pressed on this point later, could not in fact remember inviting him at all, but he was charming and tall, and had brought her a small bouquet of sea lavender wrapped in brown paper, and after the second glass of champagne she had ceased to inquire. At 7:30, dinner was announced. At 7:45, Sir Henry Pryor was observed to leave the table. At 8 precisely, a scream was heard from the lower garden, not a loud scream, and not a sustained one, but the sort of scream which a well-bred Englishwoman emits when she has seen something she would rather not have seen, and has remembered, in the same instant, that screaming is vulgar. The scream belonged to Miss Harding of Surrey. She had gone, she explained afterwards, to look at the tuberoses which had so unaccountably migrated from the hall to the lower terrace, and also because Sir Henry had not returned to his cold consommé, and she was a woman who did not care to see consommé wasted. She had walked down the stone steps between the cypresses. She had turned at the little fountain where the gardener, M. Brochet, kept his goldfish, and she had found Sir Henry Prior face downwards among the aloes, with the small, bright handle of a fruit knife protruding from a point just below his left shoulder blade. It was, she said afterwards, the tuberoses beside him that she found particularly upsetting. Someone had placed them there quite tidily, as one lays flowers at a grave. Mrs. Whitstable, summoned from her seat at the head of the table, behaved throughout the next half-hour with a composure that several of her guests subsequently described as admirable and two described as suspicious. She sent for the doctor. She sent for the gendarmerie at Beaulieu. She did not send for Madame d'Auvergne, who had retired, rather suddenly, to powder her nose at some point between the soup and the scream, and who was discovered, eventually, in the small music room at the back of the house, weeping without any discernible noise. The gendarmes arrived at 25 minutes past 9. They were courteous, perspiring, and entirely out of their depth. By 10 o'clock the brigadier had placed a telephone call to Nice, and by 10:30 a second telephone call had been placed from Nice to Aix-en-Provence, where a certain stout gentleman of the Sûreté was understood to be taking a short holiday in the company of an English friend. The stout gentleman, when the message reached him, was eating bouillabaisse. He laid down his spoon, wiped his moustache with considerable care, and remarked to the English friend across the table, "My dear Ricardo, it appears that the sea air of Aix is about to disagree with me. We shall be in Beaulieu before breakfast." Mr. Ricardo, who had been looking forward to a quiet morning, set down his own spoon with the small, resigned sigh of a man who has learned, over several summers, that holidays in the presence of Inspector Hanaud are holidays only by courtesy of the word. "I suppose," he said, "there is a body. There is always a body, my friend. The question, as ever, is whether it is the right one." And with that remark, which Mr. Ricardo was to remember, some days later, with a good deal of feeling, Hanaud returned, for the moment, to his bouillabaisse. It is a curious feature of the French railway system that, in the hours between midnight and dawn, it contrives to appear both entirely deserted and wholly preoccupied with its own affairs. The train from Aix to Nice, which Hanaud and Mr. Ricardo boarded at a little after 1 in the morning, rattled southward through the dark vineyards of the Var with the air of a creature that had been told to hurry and resented the instruction. Mr. Ricardo, who had packed in 15 minutes and regretted it in 20, sat opposite his friend in the wagon-lit compartment and endeavored, without success, to maintain an expression of alert intelligence. He was a man of comfortable habits and unfashionable opinions, and he had discovered, over the course of several continental summers, that Hanaud's company could be relied upon to supply him with both discomfort and education in roughly equal measure. "You have not told me," he said at last, "who sent the telegram." The telegram was sent by one Brigadier Lemaitre of the gendarmerie at Beaulieu. He is, I am informed, a conscientious officer, and he has had the wisdom to touch nothing. This is itself a small miracle. Provincial policemen, my friend, are like provincial cooks. They cannot bear to leave a dish alone, and they almost always improve it into something inedible. And the victim? An English banker, Sir Henry Prior. A name, I confess, which means nothing to me. "It means a good deal in the city," said Ricardo, with the mild pomposity of a man who regarded the city as a species of private club to which he had, by good fortune, been elected. Prior and Wainwright, a very sound house. Though I did hear some talk, last autumn, of difficulties. Hanaud, who had been looking at the small square of darkness beyond the window, turned his large, pale face towards his companion with an expression of benign interest. "Difficulties," he repeated. "That is a word the English employ when they wish to indicate a catastrophe without distressing the servants." "What sort of difficulties?" "Oh, nothing proven. A matter of some South American bonds. One heard whispers." "One always hears whispers, Mr. Ricardo. The question is whether one listens to them, or merely nods and passes the port." Ricardo, who had, on the occasion in question, done precisely the latter, found nothing to reply. He gazed at the pattern of the upholstery, which was an ambitious shade of puce, and consoled himself with the thought that at Marseille there would be coffee. At Marseille there was coffee, and there was also a copy of the morning edition of Le Petit Niçois, in which the death of Sir Henry Prior had been accorded a single paragraph at the foot of the third page. Under the heading Drame mondaine à Beaulieu, the report was masterly in its vagueness. A distinguished English gentleman had been taken ill at a private reception. The gendarmerie were making inquiries. Further details were expected. "Taken ill," Hanaud observed, folding the paper. "It is a diagnosis of admirable discretion. A fruit knife between the ribs is, I grant you, a form of indisposition. But one does not, as a rule, recover from it. You think the paper has been spoken to?" "I think, my friend, that the paper has been dined. Mrs. Whitstable, by the accounts I have received, is a lady of some standing in the district. She will have telephoned the editor before she telephoned the priest." The train moved on. The sky behind the olive groves turned from black to the color of weak tea, and then, with the abruptness peculiar to southern dawns, to a pale and unforgiving gold. By the time they ran into Nice, the sea was already the blue of a picture postcard, and the porters on the platform were greeting one another with the exhausted good humor of men who had been up all night for reasons they could not explain. A car had been sent. It was driven by a young officer of the Sûreté called Perrin, whose moustache had been grown in the hope that it would lend him authority, and had succeeded only in lending him a look of perpetual mild surprise. He saluted, opened the door, and delivered, as they drove along the coast road, a report of admirable concision. "The body is still at the villa, monsieur. The doctor has signed the certificate death by a single wound, the instrument remaining in situ. He estimates the hour between 7:45 and 5 past. The guests are at the Hôtel du Cap, which is to say 15 of them. The 16th. "Ah," said Hanaud gently. "The 16th has gone." "Gone where?" "That, monsieur, is what we do not know. Madame d'Auvergne was last seen in the music room at about 10. At 11, she was not in the music room. At midnight, her motor car was found at the station at Villefranche, and the night train had left at 20 past. Hanaud received this information with no visible change of expression. He sat very still, with his large hands folded on his knees, and looked out at the sea, which was already beginning to fill with the small white sails of fishing boats returning from the night's work. "The night train," he said at last, "goes where?" "To Ventimiglia, monsieur, and from Ventimiglia to Genoa, and from Genoa to wherever one cares to go." "Yes. Thank you, Perrin. That is very tidy." "That is very tidy indeed." Mr. Ricardo, who had been listening with the quickening attention of a man who has begun to suspect he is present at the opening of a theatrical piece, could not forbear to observe, "Then surely, if she has fled—" "Ah, my friend." Hanaud turned to him with the slow and faintly disappointed smile of a schoolmaster who has heard the same answer from a succession of boys. "If she has fled, if. It is the most dangerous word in the language of police work. People flee for so many reasons, Mr. Ricardo, because they are guilty, yes, but also because they are frightened or inconvenienced or in love, or merely because they have remembered an appointment in Milan. Before we conclude that Madame d'Auvergne has fled, let us establish, if we can, that Madame d'Auvergne has not been sent." "Sent?" "Sent, driven, persuaded, accompanied." Or, indeed, and here he permitted himself the faintest of shrugs, been carried. It is early in the morning. I do not yet care to commit myself to a verb. The Villa Mirabelle, in the pale light of 7 o'clock, had lost a good deal of the glamour it had possessed the night before. The oleanders along the drive were dusty, the white gravel had been trampled by a dozen official boots, and on the terrace, where 16 place settings had been laid for dinner, the cloth remained upon the table, the napkins folded, the candles burnt down in their silver sticks. Someone, a servant, presumably had cleared the consommé, but the rest of the first course, a thing of little green melons and Bayonne ham, stood untouched beneath a gathering of flies. Brigadier Lemaitre was waiting for them at the door. He was a small, neat man with the expression of a terrier that had been promised a rat and found only paperwork. He saluted Hanaud, shook Mr. Ricardo's hand with considerable ceremony, and led them through the hall to the lower terrace, where a sheet had been drawn over what had once been Sir Henry Prior. Hanaud did not at once approach the body. He stood for some time on the upper step, with his hands behind his back, and looked instead at the arrangement of the garden, the 2 cypresses, the little fountain with its goldfish, the stone bench, the aloes. Then he looked up, towards the windows of the villa. Then he looked down again, at the gravel path, and at the bowl of tuberoses which had been set still quite tidily beside the sheet. "Brigadier," he said, without turning, "who placed the flowers?" "Monsieur?" "The tuberoses. Who placed them there? A servant, on finding the body? A guest, in some impulse of sentiment? Or were they there already, when Miss Harding came down the steps?" The brigadier consulted his notebook with the unhappy air of a man who had not asked the question, and now perceived, distinctly, that he ought to have done. I do not know, monsieur." "No," said Hanaud kindly. "Neither do I, but I shall. It is a small point, brigadier." "It may be a very small point indeed." Or, and he turned, at last, and fixed upon his colleague the mild, pale, unblinking stare which Mr. Ricardo had long ago learned to dread. It may prove to be the one point upon which the whole affair, in its own good time, decides to turn. He stepped down onto the path. Mr. Ricardo, following a pace behind, had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation that the morning, despite every appearance to the contrary, had only just begun. The sheet was drawn back, and Sir Henry Prior, in the unflattering clarity of the southern morning, was revealed to be precisely as dead as Brigadier Lemaitre had reported, and considerably less distinguished. Death, Mr. Ricardo had often reflected, was the great leveller of tailors. A suit from Savile Row lost, upon its wearer's demise, most of the advantages for which one had paid. Hanaud knelt. He did not touch the body. He inspected the handle of the fruit knife, a slender, silver-mounted thing with a short blade and a scrolled monogram, and then, with the patience of a man examining an old coin at a fair, he inspected the ground about it. He looked at the aloes. He looked at the gravel. He looked, for a surprisingly long moment, at nothing at all. "The monogram," he said at last, "is C.W." "The house silver, monsieur," said Lemaitre, consulting his notebook with some relief at a question he could answer. "Whitstable. The fruit knives belong to the table service." "They were on the dinner table last night?" "They were laid at each place, monsieur, with the dessert spoons. It was to be melons and peaches after." "Admirable. So any of the 16 guests, upon rising from the table, might have taken one away in a pocket or a reticule, and no servant the wiser." "Any of the 15, monsieur?" Hanaud looked up. "The 15? Sir Henry, monsieur, would not as a general rule stab himself between the shoulder blades." Mr. Ricardo, who had been bracing himself against the trunk of an umbrella pine and endeavouring to think of anything other than what lay at his feet, gave a small, involuntary laugh, and was at once ashamed of it. Hanaud, however, smiled. "You are quite right, brigadier. I stand corrected. 15, then. Let us at least begin with a figure which is not insulting to the laws of anatomy." He rose, dusted his knees with the back of his hand, and walked not towards the body, which had now ceased to interest him, but away from it, up the stone steps, and along the upper terrace to the western corner of the villa. Here he stopped. Mr. Ricardo, who had followed at a decent distance, came up beside him. The corner of the villa, at this point, was pierced by a tall, narrow window shuttered in pale green. The shutter on the left hung flush against the wall. The shutter on the right, by contrast, stood slightly open, perhaps an inch, perhaps a little more, and was held in that position by the simple circumstance that its lower hinge, at some point in the recent past, had parted company with the plaster. Hanaud stood before this shutter for what seemed, to his companion, an unreasonable length of time. "It is," observed Mr. Ricardo, after the silence had begun to embarrass him, "a broken shutter. It is a broken shutter, my friend. Yes, you have a gift, at times, for the essential. I only meant a house of this size will have a dozen such." No doubt, but this one overlooks the lower terrace." He gestured, without turning, at the little fountain and the aloes below. "From this window one may see, shall we say, a good deal that passes among the goldfish." Ricardo considered this in silence. Hanaud, meanwhile, had stepped back from the shutter and was now examining the gravel directly beneath it, which had been raked, at some point in the last day or two, into the neat diagonal lines beloved of French gardeners. The raking was undisturbed. "No one," said Hanaud thoughtfully, "has stood here." "Under the window?" "Under the window, Mr. Ricardo, which is curious, because someone, at some point, has opened the window." He pointed. "You see the small scuff, here, upon the sill? The paint is fresh, and it has been chipped, quite lately, by a hand in a hurry, but the gravel beneath is not marked. Therefore the hand which opened the window did not come from outside, it came from within. I fail to see." "You will see, my friend. In due course, you will see. For the moment, let us only remark that a window in a house of 15 guests may be opened, from the inside, for a great many purposes. To admit air, to admit a signal, to admit—" He paused, and looked again at the broken shutter with what might, in another man, have been taken for affection, a tuberose. It was at this point that they were joined upon the terrace by Mrs. Whitstable herself, who had been informed of their arrival and had, with a promptness that struck even Hanaud as admirable, risen, dressed, breakfasted, and composed her features into an expression of tragic hospitality. She was in dove-grey again, with a black ribbon at her throat, and she carried a small lace handkerchief, which she had plainly been instructed, by some inward voice of propriety, to keep at all times between the fingers of her left hand. "Monsieur Hanaud, it is a very great kindness that you have come, madame. It is my duty, and not my kindness, but I thank you for the courtesy. You will wish to speak with me. With you, madame, and with your niece, and with each of your guests in turn. If it is not an imposition, I should like to begin with yourself. Shall we walk in the garden? Let us, by all means, walk in the garden. It is where most things in my experience are said." They walked. Mr. Ricardo, uncertain whether he had been included in this arrangement, followed a pace or two behind and did his best to look like a man admiring the bougainvillea. Brigadier Lemaitre, with the tact of a provincial officer who had grasped that he was for the moment dismissed, busied himself with the gendarmes at the lower terrace. Sir Henry, madame, was an old friend. He was an acquaintance. My husband, while he lived, had some small investment in the bank. I have seen Sir Henry perhaps 4 times in 10 years. And yet he was among the 16 last night. He was staying at the Hôtel du Cap. It would have been uncivil to pass him over. Quite so. And Madame d'Auvergne? Mrs. Whitstable hesitated. Not long, but long enough for a woman of Hanaud's profession to notice. She adjusted the handkerchief. Madame d'Auvergne I have known rather longer. She took a house at Villefranche for the season. It is, you understand, a small society here in summer. And she and Sir Henry, they were acquainted? I believe they had met. In Paris, perhaps. I cannot say with certainty. And last night, madame, were they seated near one another? They were. I had placed Sir Henry on my right, and Madame d'Auvergne 2 seats beyond him. She was to have been between Sir Henry and the Belgian cellist, who did not come. Between. Yes. It is a suggestive preposition, madam. Mrs. Whitstable declined to rise to this. She had, Ricardo observed, the calm of a woman who had long ago decided which of her feelings she intended to show, and which she did not. The dove-grey gown moved quietly beside Hanaud's black coat along the gravel path, and for some moments there was no sound but that of the cicadas in the pines. At length Hanaud said, almost idly, "The young man, madame, Mr. Fielding." "Yes? He is a painter, I understand." So he represented himself. "Ah, that is an interesting turn of phrase. You are not persuaded?" "I am not unpersuaded, monsieur. I am merely uninformed. He was brought last week to a luncheon at the Greniers, and I found him amiable. I wrote to him at his pension in Nice and invited him. He came. I have not asked him to produce a canvas. One seldom does, at dinner. And last night, at the moment of the incident, where was Mr. Fielding?" "At the table. I am quite certain of it." "Certain, madame?" "Certain. He had been speaking to my niece about the Matisse exhibition, and she had said something about the colour blue which had amused him, and he was still laughing when the scream came. Your niece will confirm this." "She will." "Then that, for the present, is one person accounted for." They had reached, by now, the end of the upper walk, where a low stone wall looked out over the descending terraces and, beyond them, to the bay. The sea, at this hour, was already beginning to acquire the small private glitter which it reserved, each morning, for bathers and bereaved widows. Hanaud rested one large hand upon the wall and regarded the view with the expression of a man who has seen a great many views and found most of them to contain, on closer inspection, a number of things which their owners had not intended. "Madame," he said, "I am going to ask you one question, and I shall not ask it twice. Why did Madame d'Auvergne leave your house last night?" Mrs. Whitstable did not answer immediately. She looked not at Hanaud, but at the distant white sail of a yacht crossing towards Cap Ferrat, and the lace handkerchief between her fingers was, for the first time, briefly still. "I cannot tell you, monsieur," she said at last, "because I do not know, but I can tell you that she did not expect to." "She did not expect to leave?" "She had arranged to stay the night. Her valise was in the blue bedroom. It is there still." Hanaud permitted himself a slow, thoughtful nod, in the manner of a man who has been handed a piece of a puzzle and is turning it to see which edge, if any, is straight. "Her valise is there still," he repeated softly. "Madame, you are a most observant hostess. I shall wish, presently, to see that valise. But first," and here he turned from the wall with a small courteous bow, "first, I think I shall speak with your niece, for it occurs to me that a young woman who can remember, at such a moment, what a gentleman was laughing at, is a young woman whose memory deserves to be taken seriously." Mrs. Whitstable inclined her head and led the way back towards the villa. As they passed beneath the green shutter, Mr. Ricardo observed, though he could not afterwards say why he observed it, that Hanaud glanced up once, and that his lips moved very slightly, as though in the framing of a private and as yet unfinished remark. Miss Alice Clavering received Inspector Hanaud in the morning-room, where the shutters had been opened upon a square of hot white garden and a view of the sea framed, rather optimistically, by striped curtains. The room contained watercolours, a piano of good family and bad tone, and several chairs in which no sensible person would willingly remain for long. Alice had chosen the least hostile of them, and was sitting very straight, with her hands folded upon her lap, as though she had been informed that composure was expected, and had decided to supply it in abundance. She was not, Mr. Ricardo thought, a beauty, but there was in her face that quality which often serves better in adversity, a clear intelligence which did not run to phrases. She looked tired without looking disordered, and if her eyes rested once, very briefly, upon the black notebook in Hanaud's hand, she gave no other sign of uneasiness. Hanaud, having bowed, did not sit down at once. He wandered to the window, glanced out, turned back, and then selected a chair which placed him neither opposite nor beside her, but at a mild diagonal, as though conversation were an arrangement best carried on with some modest allowance for retreat. "You were speaking with Mr. Fielding when Miss Harding cried out?" "Yes." "You remember what was said?" "Very nearly." "Mr. Fielding was talking nonsense about painters." "Ah," said Hanaud gently. "Then I am at once reassured. When painters talk sense, it is generally because they have taken to architecture." A flicker passed across Alice's face. It was not quite a smile, but it acknowledged one. "He had been saying," she replied, "that people only admire the Mediterranean because it is incapable of modesty. I said that English painters like it because it does not require invention. He said that blue is the most deceitful of colours." "And then?" Miss Harding screamed. "Not before? No interruption? No movement from the table?" Alice considered. Sir Henry had risen some minutes earlier. "Yes. He said the wine was too warm." "To whom did he say it?" "To my aunt, I think. Or perhaps to the butler." "No, not the butler. There was no butler, only Jules." "The superior servant without the title. Excellent. And Madame d'Auvergne?" "She had gone." "Gone where?" "I did not know at the time. I only noticed her chair was empty." "Had you seen her rise?" "No." "Had she seemed upset during dinner?" At that question, Alice's fingers moved. Not much, only enough to disturb the neat arrangement of one thumb upon the other. She had seemed annoyed. "Annoyed with Sir Henry?" "I suppose so." "You suppose?" She spoke to him twice in a low voice. He answered once. The second time he pretended not to hear. Hanaud lowered his eyes to the notebook, though Mr. Ricardo, who had by now some experience of the performance, doubted whether he wrote more than 2 words in it. "And did no one else observe this?" "I think my aunt did not. She had Miss Harding on the other side, and Miss Harding was discussing tuberoses. Mr. Fielding may have noticed. He notices most things. Whether he understands them is another matter." "That," said Hanaud, "is true of many young men who part their hair with conviction." He shut the notebook. "One more question, mademoiselle. When the scream was heard, what did Mr. Fielding do?" Alice looked up directly for the first time. He upset his glass. "From alarm?" "From speed. He was on his feet, almost at once." "And did he run towards the lower garden?" "Yes." "Before your aunt?" "Yes." "Before the servants?" "Yes." There was a small silence. Mr. Ricardo, who had no gift for silence and liked it least when others employed it with skill, shifted in his chair. Hanaud, however, seemed to regard it as an instrument of some delicacy and allowed it to remain between them until Alice, perhaps to fill it, said, "I do not think Mr. Fielding killed Sir Henry, if that is what you mean." "My dear young lady," said Hanaud, with a grave courtesy which somehow made the remark less soothing than it sounded. "I mean, as yet, nothing at all. I collect. Later, perhaps, I may arrange." He rose. Alice did the same. As they reached the door, Hanaud turned. "The blue bedroom. Madame d'Auvergne's valise is still there?" "Yes." "Was it locked?" "No." "You have looked inside?" Alice hesitated, and this time there was no doubt of it. "Yes." "Ah." Hanaud inclined his head. "Then you have saved me an impropriety. Thank you." She coloured, which did more for her appearance than any of Mrs. Whitstable's lotions could have contrived. I only wished to see whether she had truly meant to stay. And did she? There was a nightdress, a toilet case, a book of prayers in French, nothing more remarkable than that. No letters? No. No railway timetable? No. No revolver? No. "Then," said Hanaud, with satisfaction, "we have at least established that Madame d'Auvergne travelled light in every sense." When they had gone out into the corridor, Mr. Ricardo said, in a low voice, "You startled the girl." "Yes." "Deliberately?" "My friend, in England you have a curious tenderness for the truth in young women. You treat it as a bird liable to expire if brought too near daylight. I have the opposite view. Truth is a robust creature. It may flutter, but it very rarely dies. But you think she concealed something? I think she omitted something. It is not the same. What? Hanaud opened a door at random, found a linen cupboard, closed it again, and proceeded along the corridor with the air of a man strolling through a museum in which the labels had not been properly arranged. What she omitted, Mr. Ricardo, is not yet ready to be told. If one pulls at a thread too soon, one gets not a pattern but a tangle. Let us wait until the cloth has shown itself. This was the sort of answer which made friendship with Hanaud at once durable and exhausting. They found Mrs. Whitstable in the breakfast room, directing the removal of untouched coffee with a firmness which suggested that murder, though deplorable, need not excuse inefficiency. Lawrence Fielding was standing by the mantelpiece with an air of decorative distress. He wore white flannels, a blue tie, and the expression of a young man who has suddenly discovered that charm is of no use whatever against official inquiry. He came forward at once. "Inspector, I hope you'll speak to me next. I'd rather get it over." "Over?" Hanaud repeated, almost kindly. "My dear monsieur, I have not yet begun." Fielding flushed. Up close he was less finished than he had seemed at dinner, his chin too eager, his eyes a trifle too ready to meet one's own. The sort of young man, Mr. Ricardo reflected, whom older women invited because he flattered their taste and younger women tolerated because he was tall. "I only meant," said Fielding, "that I can tell you very little. Yet Mademoiselle tells me you notice most things." Fielding glanced, very quickly, at Alice, who had just come into the room behind them. The glance was brief, civil, and entirely sufficient. "That depends who's speaking," he said. "Quite so. Then let us limit ourselves to one thing only. Last night, when Miss Harding screamed, you ran before anyone else to the lower terrace." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I was nearest the steps." "No." The word was not spoken loudly. It did not need to be. Mrs. Whitstable's hand, poised over the coffee service, became still. Alice looked at Hanaud. Fielding looked at him too, and something young and obstinate tightened in his face. "No?" "No. You were not nearest the steps. Sir George Hatherley was nearer, so was Jules. Yet neither of them ran first. You did. Why?" Fielding gave a short laugh, not of amusement but of discomfort. "Because I'm younger than Sir George, and quicker than a servant." A graceful answer, also a false one. "You seem very sure." "I am a little sure. It is enough for the moment." There was a pause. Fielding thrust one hand into his trouser pocket and then withdrew it again, remembering perhaps that pockets were bad company for nervous fingers. "I heard something before the scream," he said at last. Mrs. Whitstable turned towards him sharply. "What?" "A chair," said Fielding, "or what I took for a chair. Something knocked over below." "And why?" asked Hanaud. "Did you not mention this at once?" Fielding's mouth hardened. "Because in houses like this, Inspector, if one mentions every small noise, one's hostess never asks one again." For the first time that morning, Mrs. Whitstable looked as though she might have been honestly surprised. Hanaud merely bowed. "Then, monsieur, we are indebted to your social caution. It has delayed us, but perhaps not fatally." He moved towards the door. "Come, Mr. Ricardo, I think we will now speak with Jules. Servants, whatever their title, make the best witnesses in Europe. They hear everything and believe nothing. It is a discipline from which society might profit." As they went out, Ricardo cast a backward glance into the room. Alice had turned away to the window. Mrs. Whitstable was still standing at the coffee table. Fielding remained by the mantelpiece, but his decorative distress had vanished. In its place, there was something much less ornamental and much more useful to an investigator: irritation. Mr. Ricardo followed Hanaud down the passage, thoroughly puzzled again, and not for the first time with the uneasy conviction that everyone in the villa had begun, quite independently, to behave as though a different story were being told in each room. Jules, the upper servant without the butler's title, and very nearly with the butler's opinions, received Inspector Hanaud in the pantry with the disapproval of a man who considered murder an intrusion upon routine. He was a lean Provençal in his 50s, shaved to the point of austerity, with that expression of patient contempt which excellent servants reserve for all employers equally and only moderate according to wages. He stood beside a marble slab upon which peaches had been arranged for a dessert that had never occurred. "You laid the fruit knives last night?" said Hanaud. "Yes, monsieur." "All 16?" "Yes, monsieur." "And after the scream?" "I did not count them." "No, one seldom does, in the middle of a tragedy." Yet afterwards, when the table was cleared, Jules allowed himself the smallest movement of the shoulders. "There were 15. Oh." Mr. Ricardo, who had attached himself to a shelf of preserves and was endeavouring to look unofficial, was obliged to admit that this in Hanaud's mouth contained an altogether unreasonable quantity of meaning. "Which knife was missing?" Hanaud continued. "The one at the place of Madame d'Auvergne." There was a short silence. Jules, having delivered this sentence, seemed prepared to let it stand by itself, unsupported by embellishment, and, if possible, by further inquiry. Hanaud contemplated him with approval. "You observed this at once?" "No, monsieur, not at once. Later." "How much later?" "When the police asked whether any knife in the house was wanting." "And before that, it did not occur to you to remark that the weapon in the garden came from Madame d'Auvergne's place?" Jules looked straight ahead. "It occurred to me, monsieur, that if one is to be mixed up in an affair of guests and police, one should first be certain. A most prudent rule. France would be quieter if more citizens obeyed it." Hanaud crossed one leg over the other. "Now tell me this. The tuberoses in the lower garden, who moved them?" Jules blinked once, which in a man of his restraint was almost theatrical. "I did not know they had been moved, monsieur." "They had stood in the hall?" "Yes, monsieur, in the blue bowl." "And when did you last see them there?" "Before dinner. Miss Clavering arranged them herself." "After dinner?" "I went through the hall twice. I did not notice the bowl." "Because it was gone?" "Because I was carrying plates, monsieur." It was an admirable answer, and, which was rarer, an honest one. Hanaud inclined his head. "You heard any disagreement at table?" "No disagreement, monsieur. Only English voices becoming quieter, which is often much the same thing." "Between whom?" "Sir Henry and Madame d'Auvergne." "You heard words?" "Two only, from the lady." "What words?" "This evening." "And from Sir Henry?" Jules considered. He said, "Not here." Mr. Ricardo shifted among the preserves. One learned, in Hanaud's company, to value small conversations which had not been addressed to oneself. They so frequently proved to contain the whole of a difficulty folded up like a railway rug. Hanaud rose. "One last matter, Jules. Mr. Fielding, did he leave the table before the scream?" "No, monsieur." "You are certain?" "Yes, monsieur." "And Sir George Hatherley?" "The same." "The ladies?" "Miss Harding rose once, before the fish, to look for the flowers in the hall. She came back." "The flowers?" "The tuberoses, monsieur. She wished to smell them." "Did she find them?" "No, monsieur." Hanaud's large face became for a moment singularly blank, which with him was generally a sign of inward activity. "She mentioned this?" "To Miss Clavering, monsieur," she said. "How odd. They have vanished." Miss Clavering replied, "Then perhaps they have had more sense than the rest of us." For the first time, Hanaud smiled broadly. "Mademoiselle has wit. That is very dangerous in a house of mourning." The blue bedroom was at the western corner of the villa, and it was at once plain to Mr. Ricardo that the green shutter belonged to it. The window opened over the lower terrace and the fountain. The broken hinge had left one shutter, standing perpetually ajar, with the air of an indiscretion too old to be repaired and too useful to be acknowledged. Madame d'Auvergne's valise stood on a luggage rack at the foot of the bed. It was of dark leather, handsome, expensive, and packed with the discipline of a woman who mistrusted hotels. There were 2 evening gowns, folded blouses in tissue paper, a silver-backed brush, the promised prayer book, and a travelling case of ivory fittings from which one small glass bottle was missing. Hanaud lifted the lid of the case and examined the empty recess. "Her scent," he murmured. Mrs. Whitstable, who had accompanied them with resignation and a key, said from the doorway, "I suppose so. You have smelt it before?" "Frequently. One could scarcely avoid it. Something dark, not one of your innocent floral English perfumes." Alice Clavering, standing beside her aunt, said quietly, "It was not dark, it was dry." Hanaud turned. "Dry?" "Yes. I don't know how else to describe it. Like powdered wood and a little bitter." Mrs. Whitstable gave her niece a faintly astonished glance. "My dear Alice, I had no notion you had become a perfumer." "I haven't, only observant." "Observation," said Hanaud pleasantly, "is a form of unpaid labour at which women are expected to excel and never thanked." He had taken from the valise a sheet of cream tissue bearing, in violet lettering, the words Valet Parfumeur, Rue d'Antibes, Cannes. Beneath it lay a small billfold, empty save for a card embossed with the same name. "Madame," he said to Mrs. Whitstable, "if I borrow your motor car for 2 hours, will society forgive you?" "At present," said Mrs. Whitstable, "society is not in a position to refuse me anything." "Excellent. Then Mr. Ricardo and I will go to Cannes." Mr. Ricardo, who had not known this until the moment it was announced, bowed as though the arrangement had been his own suggestion. As they left the room, Hanaud paused by the window. He put one large hand upon the sill, glanced down to the garden below, and then, unexpectedly, sniffed the air. "What is it?" asked Ricardo. "The room has been aired." Well?" "By someone who did not care for the smell left behind." The drive to Cannes lay along a coast already busy with sunshine, laundry, gossip, and motor horns. Villages appeared and vanished among pines. English women in broad hats supervised parasols with an air of imperial oversight. Young men in white trousers walked with an energy that suggested no occupation more burdensome than admiration. The Riviera, Ricardo thought, made idleness seem a profession and seriousness a social mistake. Rue d'Antibes was full by 11 o'clock. Shop awnings striped the light into manageable pieces. A fishmonger was shouting with artistic despair. Outside a milliner's, 2 American ladies were conducting an assault upon hats. Valet Parfumeur occupied a narrow shop between a jeweler's and a dealer in Swiss watches, and presented to the street a facade so modest that one understood at once it was expensive. Inside, the air changed. It was cool, dim, and faintly golden, as though scent had replaced atmosphere and was charging rent. Bottles stood in glass cases like minor nobility. Drawers of soaps and sachets lined the walls, and behind a counter of black wood, a gentleman with silver hair and a carnation in his buttonhole raised his eyes with the composure of one who expected either excellent manners or immediate departure. "Monsieur Valet," said Hanaud. "At your service." Hanaud produced his card. Monsieur Valet read it, looked once at Mr. Ricardo, and dismissed him, in the kindest possible way, as a foreign accessory. "You knew Madame d'Auvergne?" Valet's expression altered, though only slightly. "Certainly, a valued client." "She bought perfume here?" "She bought discernment here, monsieur." The perfume followed. "Her usual choice?" "An iris with amber, very restrained, very intelligent. She disliked sweetness." "And tuberose?" The perfumer's eyebrows rose. "Tuberose?" "She detested it." "Detested?" "It reminded her of convent chapels and provincial brides. She told me so herself. It gave her headaches." Hanaud nodded, as though some private account had been balanced to the sou. And yet, he said, almost idly, yesterday or the day before, someone bought tuberose here. Valette's fingers rested lightly on the counter. Yes. A lady? No. A servant? No. A young man? Yes. English? I should say so. Known to you? Not by name. Can you describe him? Valette considered with professional conscience. Tall, fair, well-dressed, though not as a Frenchman dresses. A face which wished to be taken for careless, and had practiced. He asked not for a perfume to wear, but for essence strong, unmistakable. He said he wished to scent flowers. Mr. Ricardo felt, quite distinctly, that the room had become less cool. Flowers? Said Hanaud. Yes, cut flowers. He asked whether a stale bloom might be made more vivid. And what did you tell him? That almost anything may be made more vivid, monsieur, if one is indifferent to subtlety. A faint smile touched Hanaud's mouth. You sold it to him. I am a tradesman. Indeed. And when was this? Yesterday afternoon, between 4 and 5. Did he buy anything else? Yes, a small atomizer, travel size. For himself? I did not ask. Of course not. One does not interrogate vanity. Valette spread his hands very slightly. In my profession, monsieur, people prefer to be understood without the vulgarity of explanation. Hanaud bowed. In that, he said, your profession resembles mine more than I care to admit. They took their leave. Outside, the street seemed noisy to the point of vulgarity. Mr. Ricardo walked beside Hanaud for some yards before speaking. Well, he said at last, that appears plain enough. Hanaud stopped before the jeweller's window and examined a tray of brooches with grave attention. No, my friend, he said, it appears the opposite, which is why it interests me. He turned back towards the waiting motor car. Let us go home. I have learned 2 things. Madame d'Auvergne did not choose tuberoses, and someone at the villa wished us very much to believe that she did. He got into the car, settled himself heavily, and added, almost as an afterthought, what I have not yet learned is whether that someone is foolish, sentimental, or merely young. On the Riviera, these conditions often travel together. If one asks 3 civilized people what happened between 7:45 and 8 o'clock, one does not, as a rule, receive 3 lies. One receives something much more troublesome. 3 conscientious arrangements of truth, each trimmed to flatter memory and spare vanity. Inspector Hanaud, who had long ago formed a high opinion of vanity and a low one of memory, spent the late afternoon of that same day in collecting exactly such arrangements. The first was offered by Sir George Hatherley at the Hôtel du Cap. Sir George was a retired colonel of engineers. The retirement had done nothing to diminish the military quality of his moustache, which remained at attention even when its owner was at ease. He sat with Hanaud and Mr. Ricardo in a cool corner of the hotel lounge, overlooking the sea, and delivered his recollections with a precision which was evidently meant to suggest reliability and chiefly suggested training. I was on Lady Hatherley's left, he said. Prior was across the table, a little to the right of Mrs. Whitstable. Miss Harding was talking flowers. The painter fellow was making conversation with Miss Clavering. Madame d'Auvergne seemed out of sorts. I remarked it to my wife afterwards. You remarked everything to your wife afterwards? Asked Hanaud. Sir George frowned. I make a practice of reporting accurately. I congratulate Lady Hatherley. Sir George either chose not to hear the remark or considered it beneath response. At about 7:45, Prior excused himself, said something about the heat. He had looked queer for some time. Queer in what manner? Hanaud asked. Nervous, distracted, a man with something on his mind. That, Sir George, describes half the male population of Europe. Then he belonged to the half I mistrust, said the colonel. He had the habit of turning his head while others spoke to him, as though listening for another conversation elsewhere. Mr. Ricardo, who knew several bankers and had occasionally envied them, privately admitted that this seemed plausible. "And Madame d'Auvergne?" said Hanaud. "She left the table 2 or 3 minutes later." "You saw her go?" "Yes." She rose very quietly. "No one marked it. I did." "Because you report accurately." "Because," said Sir George, stiffening, "I was in the army." "Of course. And after she rose?" "Nothing. Talk. Fish," Miss Harding asking after the tuberoses. Then the scream. "Did Mr. Fielding leave his seat before the scream?" "No, I am certain of it. Yet he ran first." "He is young." Hanaud folded his hands over his stomach. "And did you hear any sound from the garden before Miss Harding cried out?" Sir George hesitated. It was the first hesitation he had allowed himself. "Possibly." "Ah, a thump, or a chair. I did not attach importance to it. But now? Now I consider it may have been the body falling." Hanaud inclined his head politely, as though receiving a visiting card he had no intention of keeping. "Thank you, Sir George. You have been most exact." Sir George drew himself up. "I hope so." "Oh, certainly," said Hanaud. "Whether exactitude and accuracy are always acquainted is another matter." Mr. Ricardo, as they rose, observed that the Colonel's moustache had become almost militant. Lady Hatherley received them on the terrace, under a striped awning, and beside a teapot which appeared to have been issued under the Articles of War. She was a thin, fair woman of 60, who had contrived, through 40 years of matrimony, to become exquisitely deaf to command, while remaining sharply alive to significance. "George has been talking to you," she said at once. "He has had that kindness. Then, I shall not attempt to improve upon him. He dislikes competition." "That," said Hanaud, sitting down, "is what recommends him to me." Lady Hatherley smiled with the absent-minded benevolence of a woman who had spent years discovering that truth, if left to itself, often grew out of the cracks in military discipline like moss. "You want to know about last night," she said. "What everyone wants to know, though they all pretend to want tea. I would not refuse either." She poured. The sea below the hotel glittered offensively. Somewhere behind them crockery sounded with the insistence of good service. "Sir Henry was frightened," Lady Hatherley said. "Your husband thought him distracted." "My husband uses the vocabulary of railway timetables. I prefer simpler words." "Sir Henry was frightened." "Of Madame d'Auvergne?" "No." "Of whom, then?" Lady Hatherley stirred her tea without drinking it. "I cannot say, but not of her. He was irritated by her, embarrassed perhaps, but not frightened." "What makes you distinguish so carefully?" "Because I have been married for 40 years. One learns the shades." Hanaud gave a small bow of respect. "And Madame d'Auvergne?" "She was angry." "With Sir Henry?" "Yes." "Openly?" "Oh, no. Anger in public, Inspector, is for Americans and actresses. She was French and middle-aged. She used whispers." "And Mr. Fielding?" Lady Hatherley set down her spoon. "Mr. Fielding was watching Miss Clavering." This was said with a composure so perfect that Mr. Ricardo almost missed its importance. "Watching her with admiration?" Hanaud inquired. "With anxiety. It is a less fashionable expression, but more useful." "You observed this throughout dinner?" "Intermittently. I was not taking inventory. But each time Madame d'Auvergne spoke to Sir Henry, Mr. Fielding looked, not at them, but at Miss Clavering." "Why?" "My dear Inspector, if I knew why, I should not need you." Hanaud accepted the rebuke with gratitude. "And when Madame d'Auvergne left the table?" Lady Hatherley raised her eyes towards the bay. "I did not see her go." "George says he did. That is perfectly possible. George sees departures. I see faces. Miss Clavering became suddenly very still. That I remember." "Before or after Madame d'Auvergne left?" "Immediately after, I think, though memory is a clumsy servant, One gives it orders, and it brings back the wrong tray. Hanaud laughed, and Lady Hatherley, having successfully corrected both husband and police without appearing to do either, permitted herself a biscuit. Miss Harding's account was taken in the hotel's writing room, among guidebooks, postcards, and the sort of upholstered furniture which invites confidence in the absence of comfort. She was a woman of 38, pink from sun and principle, with a nose that had been sharpened by years of noticing things in drawing rooms. She had changed, since the night before, from pale green to a form of mauve which did nothing for her nerves. "I do hope," she began, before anyone had asked a question, "that no one supposes I enjoy being connected with this. I was merely looking for the flowers." "Yes," said Hanaud. "The tuberoses. They had been moved." "So I hear." "It was quite odd. They had been in the hall, then they were not." "And this disturbed you?" "It interested me," said Miss Harding, with dignity. "One notices these little domestic dislocations." Mr. Ricardo, who had until that moment believed the phrase belonged chiefly to geology, resolved to remember it. "You left the table to find them?" "Yes. Also because Sir Henry had not returned, and one cannot sit indefinitely before fish while people disappear into gardens." "A sound social principle," murmured Hanaud. "When you went down the steps, what did you see first?" "The bowl. That is to say, the flowers first, then Sir Henry." "They were beside him?" "Yes, not strewn, placed." "Placed by whom?" "How can I tell?" "One can always tell something, mademoiselle. If not the who, then the how." "Were the stems wet?" Miss Harding blinked. "I really don't know." "Had water spilled?" "I think not." "So the flowers may have been carried dry?" "I suppose so. Or the bowl may have stood there for some minutes already." "Yes, if you like. I like possibilities very much. They are modest, and rarely insist upon themselves too soon." Miss Harding shifted. "I did hear something before I went down." Hanaud looked up. "A sound?" "Voices." "From the garden?" "No, above. From one of the windows, I thought. A man and a woman." Mr. Ricardo leaned forward despite himself. "Could you distinguish words?" "Only one," the woman said. "No, not loudly. More as if she had said it several times already and was tired of it." "And the man?" "I could not hear him." "Before the scream?" "Yes. A minute, perhaps, or less." "Which window?" Miss Harding looked alarmed by the question, as though windows, like foreign irregular verbs, ought not to be pinned down so exactly. "One of the west windows. The one with the green shutter, perhaps. I cannot swear to it." "The green shutter," Hanaud repeated softly. "Yes." "And you told no one this before?" Miss Harding coloured. "Well, really, Inspector, a woman hesitates to repeat overheard fragments if they may turn out to be innocent." "Indeed," said Hanaud gravely. "It is one of the last courtesies left to civilization." When she had gone, Mr. Ricardo said, "Well?" Hanaud stood by the writing-room window, looking out not at the sea but at the reflection of the room in the glass. "Well, my friend, we now possess 3 accounts of the same short interval. In the first, Madame d'Auvergne leaves the table, and Sir Henry soon dies. In the second, Sir Henry is frightened. Mr. Fielding is anxious, and Miss Clavering knows something before anyone says it aloud. In the third, there is a voice at the green shutter. And which is true?" Hanaud turned, and his broad, pale face assumed that expression of mild amusement with which he generally accompanied the withholding of anything useful. "Almost certainly all of them," he said. "That is the inconvenience." He took up his hat. "Come, we will go back to the villa. I begin to suspect that what happened between 7:45 and 8 o'clock did not occur in the garden at all. It was Mrs. Whitstable herself who proposed the dinner, and Mr. Ricardo was disposed to think that it did her credit. A woman of lesser composition, having lost a guest in her garden one evening, might have been expected to decline social enterprise for at least a fortnight. Mrs. Whitstable, on the contrary, declared that the Hotel du Cap was the proper place to dine the following night, that she would herself reserve the table, and that those of her guests who had not yet found reason to leave the Riviera would oblige her by attending. "It is the only way," she said to Alice, with the grim practicality of a hostess who had once run a field hospital in the Dardanelles, "to discover which of them is unable to eat." Inspector Hanaud, when the proposal reached him, inclined his large head in polite assent, and murmured to Mr. Ricardo that he had seldom been offered a stratagem so elegant by anyone not already a suspect. The party, somewhat reduced by discretion and departing trains, numbered 9 Mrs. Whitstable and her niece, Sir George and Lady Hatherley, Miss Harding in dark blue, as a concession to gravity, Lawrence Fielding, a colonel and Madame Grenier of Villefranche, who had been at dinner the previous night but had been, in Hanaud's phrase, acoustically inert, and, at the foot of the table, Hanaud himself with Mr. Ricardo on his right. The dining-room of the Hotel du Cap was laid with that careful exaggeration of linen which French hotels reserved for English visitors. Beyond the tall windows, the evening was arranging itself with its usual lack of originality, the sea pink, the pines black, the shadows long enough to flatter. A quartet of aging musicians in the far corner were playing Massenet at a tactful volume, which is to say almost inaudibly. "It is curious," Mr. Ricardo observed, under cover of the soup, "how well everyone looks." "It is not curious at all," Hanaud replied. "A society dinner after a death is like a funeral attended in defiance. Everyone dresses with slightly more care than usual, as a kind of argument." "An argument with whom?" "With fate, my friend, or with the neighbours. The distinction is not always clear upon the Riviera." Mrs. Whitstable, at the head of the table, had with evident forethought placed Lawrence Fielding between Lady Hatherley and Miss Harding, which was to say between a woman who observed everything and a woman who repeated it. Alice sat opposite him, beside Colonel Grenier. Hanaud watched the arrangement with appreciation. "Your aunt," he remarked quietly to Alice, as they took their places, "has the makings of a commissaire. She only understands seating, monsieur. That, mademoiselle, is already 3/4 of detection. For the first 2 courses, the conversation was of the sort invented by the English to conceal that they are thinking. The weather, which had already been discussed extensively at earlier meals, was reconsidered. The wine, a white cassis of restrained ambition, was approved. Sir George embarked upon a long anecdote concerning a mule at Sollum in 1917, which nobody interrupted and nobody followed. Madame Grenier, who had been pretty in the 90s and had never entirely surrendered the conviction, addressed several remarks to Fielding in a voice pitched for the wider table. It was between the fish and the lamb that Hanaud began, in his quiet, almost apologetic way, to disturb the surface of the water. "Madame," he said, leaning slightly towards Mrs. Whitstable, "I am troubled by a small detail which perhaps you can assist me to resolve, if I am able. The bowl of tuberoses." There was no silence, the musicians took care of that, but something in the angle of several heads shifted minutely, as though the table had breathed. "Yes? You are certain they were in the hall when dinner was announced?" "Quite certain. I had admired them myself as the guests went in." "And afterwards? No servant moved them?" "I have asked Jules." "None did." "Then," said Hanaud, addressing the air with grave simplicity, "they moved themselves, or a guest moved them. Either hypothesis is unusual." Miss Harding, who had been conveying a piece of sole to her mouth, paused as if the sole had taken on a moral weight. "They were most peculiarly placed," she observed, to no one and to everyone, quite tidily, as one lays flowers at a grave. "Really, Amy," said Lady Hatherley, "we must try not to say that again." Miss Harding coloured. Mrs. Whitstable, with the practised benevolence of a hostess deflecting a collision, said, "Monsieur Hanaud, I cannot think flowers are material." "Madame, in the south of France they frequently are." Flowers here carry messages, as in the East they carry meanings. A tuberose, in particular, is a flower of announcements. It is the scent one associates with weddings one has regretted and funerals one has not attended. Fielding laughed briefly and a little too loudly. That is very French, Inspector. It is very floral, monsieur. The French merely noticed it first. Mr. Ricardo, who had occupied himself with his wine, observed that Alice had set down her fork. With the lamb came a change in the weather of the table. It was not that anyone said anything indiscreet. It was that everyone began, almost simultaneously, to talk a little more than was natural. Colonel Grenier expanded upon the price of vines. Miss Harding reconsidered the weather yet again. Sir George returned to his mule. Only Lady Hatherley and Hanaud, at opposite corners of the table, were silent, and their silence had about it the faint, attentive companionship of two musicians who, without consulting each other, were waiting for a particular bar. Hanaud addressed Fielding across the centerpiece. "Monsieur, you have been patient with my inquiries today. I am grateful. There is one small point I did not ask." Fielding's glass paused, very slightly, on its way to his mouth. "Yes? Have you visited Cannes this week?" Cannes, he considered, as though the name had been introduced to him for the first time. "Yes, on Tuesday." "The Rue d'Antibes?" "I believe I walked down it." "The Perfumer Valette, perhaps?" There was a pause of exactly the length required for a man to decide between two answers. "I may have looked in," Fielding said. "One does, if one is killing an afternoon." "One does, indeed? And did you buy anything?" "And a trifle, a little scent." "For a lady?" "For myself." Madame Grenier, who had been watching Fielding with that amused, proprietary expression which middle-aged Frenchwomen reserve for attractive young men, now said, with the appalling innocence of the socially secure, "For yourself?" "Oh, but I do not think so, Mr. Fielding. Men do not carry atomizers." The phrase fell upon the table with the precision of a dropped fork. Fielding coloured, quite suddenly, from the collar upward. It was the colour which cannot be arranged and cannot be hidden. "One buys what one fancies," he said. "Oh, certainly," said Madame Grenier, delighted to have made a small hit without knowing quite what she had struck. "But an atomizer, my dear young man, that is a toilet article for ladies." Hanaud, who had listened to this exchange with an expression of charitable interest, now inclined his head. "Madame is entirely correct. It is, I believe, the particular atomizer which in the shop is called Le Petit Voyage. Very pretty, a silver stopper." He turned mildly to Fielding. "Was that the one?" "I do not recall," said Fielding. "No?" said Hanaud kindly. "Young men seldom recall purchases which embarrass them." There was a short, carefully arranged silence, filled by the musicians, who were now advancing without conviction upon Saint-Saëns. Mrs. Whitstable, as though nothing particular had occurred, signalled for the salad. Alice Clavering had not moved. Her face had taken on that stillness which Lady Hatherley, some hours before, had described, not altogether pleasantly, as suddenly very still. It was Alice who spoke next, and it was to Hanaud that she spoke. "Monsieur, I should like to ask you a question." "Mademoiselle, I should be honoured." "If a man had bought such a thing for a foolish reason, a reason of vanity, or sentiment, or even mischief, and if that thing had later been made to seem significant by others, yes? Would the inspector trouble to distinguish between the purchase and the use?" Hanaud laid down his fork. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "you have described, in one sentence, 9/10 of my profession. Yes, I would trouble very much indeed. It is the business of an honest inquirer to notice the difference between a man who buys a rope and a man who hangs with it." Alice did not lower her eyes. Fielding did. Mrs. Whitstable, with magnificent tact, observed that the salad was excellent, and this happened to be true. After dinner, the party broke into that geometry of small groups, which hotels encourage with chairs. Sir George claimed Ricardo for coffee and cigars. Miss Harding was captured by Madame Grenier for views of the gardens. Mrs. Whitstable, in a voice pitched to carry no further than necessary, invited Lady Hatherley to take her arm upon the terrace. Fielding stood for a moment alone by the long window. Then, with that abrupt decision which Hanaud had described that morning as the habit of a young man who parts his hair with conviction, he crossed the room and addressed the inspector directly. "I wish to speak to you privately tonight." Hanaud looked at him without surprise. "A good hour?" 11. "On the lower terrace of the hotel, if that is agreeable." "Entirely." Fielding bowed very stiffly to Mrs. Whitstable and left the room. When he had gone, Ricardo managed at last to get Hanaud to himself, in a corner by a ruined palm, in a pot of brass. The musicians had mercifully ceased. A waiter was gathering liqueur glasses with the industry of a man who did not intend to hear what was said. "He will confess," said Ricardo, in a low voice. "Perhaps." "To what?" Hanaud looked thoughtfully towards the window through which Fielding had gone. "Ah, my friend, that is the question upon which the interest of the evening depends. He will confess, I think, to something. But to what he has done, or to what he wishes us to believe he has done, we cannot yet say." Mr. Ricardo was obliged to content himself with this, and with a small glass of brandy which he had not ordered and presently drank. On the lower terrace, beyond the open windows, the sea was folding its long, pale edge upon the rocks. A single lamp had been lit at the corner of the balustrade, and Inspector Hanaud, having glanced once at his watch, excused himself from the company with a politeness which did not quite conceal, from the one person observing closely, that he was remembering, for some private purpose of his own, Miss Harding's voice saying, "One of the west windows, the one with the green shutter." At 11 o'clock, the lower terrace of the Hôtel du Cap had the air of a place prepared for sincerity and habitually disappointed. The lamp by the balustrade cast a modest pool of light upon the paving stones. Beyond it, the garden dropped in dark, scented levels towards the sea, and the sea itself, in a moon not yet full, had acquired that bleached, indifferent glitter with which nature observes the embarrassments of human beings. Mr. Ricardo, who had been instructed by Hanaud to go to bed, and had obeyed him only in the sense that he had gone upstairs, changed his coat, and come down again by another staircase, established himself behind a group of potted palms, with the determination of a man who disapproved of clandestine interviews, and saw no reason to miss one. From where he sat he could see the lamp, the balustrade, and Inspector Hanaud, who had arrived punctually, and was now leaning with both hands upon the stone parapet, looking out to sea like a benign municipal statue erected in memory of tact. Lawrence Fielding came 3 minutes late. He came quickly, as young men do when they have resolved upon a course and are already anxious about its appearance. He wore a dark dinner jacket without a flower, which was in itself a sign either of sincerity or distraction. In the lamplight, his face looked younger than ever and decidedly less amusing. "You are alone?" he said. Hanaud turned. "My dear monsieur, at my age, one is never entirely alone. One carries too much experience for that. But visibly, yes." Fielding did not appear to find this helpful. "I asked to see you because I do not wish Miss Clavering's name brought into the thing." "The thing," said Hanaud mildly, "has already brought itself into Miss Clavering's neighborhood. That is one of its inconveniences. However, let us begin. Sit down if you like." "I'd rather stand." "Young people always would. Very well. What is it you wish to tell me?" Fielding put a hand into the inner pocket of his jacket and brought out a silver cigarette case. "Even at a distance, mister." Ricardo could see that it was handsome, old, and in the moonlight a little battered along one edge. Fielding held it out without flourish. "I found this last night." Hanaud took it. "Where?" "In the blue bedroom." The room prepared for Madame d'Auvergne. Yes. When? After the police had come, everyone was in confusion. Mrs. Whitstable sent me upstairs for a shawl for Miss Harding. I passed the open door, saw something on the rug near the dressing table, and picked it up. And put it into your pocket. Yes. Why? Fielding's answer came too quickly to be entirely prepared, and too slowly to be entirely honest. Because it was Sir Henry's. Hanaud opened the case. There were no cigarettes in it. On the inner lid, which caught the light for an instant, were engraved the initials H.P. You knew it to be Sir Henry's? I had seen him use it at luncheon 2 days earlier. And, again, why did you put it into your pocket? Fielding looked away towards the sea, where there was nothing to assist him. Because if it was in her room, in Madame d'Auvergne's room, it would look bad. For Madame d'Auvergne? For anyone. Hanaud shut the case with a small click. My dear monsieur, the world is full of objects which look bad. Their chief fault is not appearance, but meaning. Did you open it when you found it? No. Have you opened it since? Yes. When? This evening. And did you find anything inside? No. Nothing tucked behind the silver rim? No note? No theatre ticket? No key? No. Hanaud slipped the case into his own pocket, as calmly as though he were receiving visiting cards at a reception. You understand, of course, that by concealing this you have behaved like an imbecile. Fielding flushed. Yes. Good. It saves time, if we agree on the vocabulary. Now tell me why Miss Clavering's name enters this at all. Fielding was silent. Hanaud waited. He had the patience of large men, who know that impatience in others is usually stronger than their own. At 7:30, Fielding said at last, I went into the hall before dinner and saw Alice speaking with Madame d'Auvergne. Alone? Yes. What about? I couldn't hear. Yet you conclude Miss Clavering's name should be spared. I conclude nothing, said Fielding, with a sudden bitterness. I only know that Alice looked angry and that Madame d'Auvergne looked amused, which is a look some women ought not to wear too often. Indeed, it can become expensive. Go on. When dinner was announced, they stopped speaking. Alice went in by the drawing-room door. Madame d'Auvergne came a moment later, by the terrace window. The green shutter room? No, the hall window. Ah. Fielding passed a hand over his forehead. The night was warm, but the gesture was not for the heat. Then later, after the scream, when I went upstairs for the shawl, the blue bedroom door was ajar and the cigarette case was there. You have told this to Miss Clavering? No. To Mrs. Whitstable? No. To anyone at all? No. Then why? Asked Hanaud, very softly. Did you buy tuberose essence in Cannes? The young man gave a sort of involuntary start. Mr. Ricardo, behind the palms, almost rose from his chair. Fielding stared at the inspector. So you know that? I know a perfumer. He is a professional man and notices customers as I do. Why did you buy it? There was a brief, humiliating silence. For a sketch, said Fielding. Hanaud's eyebrows rose. A sketch? Yes. My dear monsieur, I am not a magistrate. You need not insult me. It is the truth. Then it is a singularly decorative one. Explain. Lubber. Fielding drew breath, looked absurdly young again, and said with an effort, I had been painting flowers, cut flowers. In the heat they collapse before one has got them. Someone told me that scent sometimes revives the impression of them, not the bloom itself, but one's sense of it. It was idiotic. I know it was idiotic. I tried it on a bowl of tuberoses in the hall yesterday afternoon. And? It made them worse. It made the whole hall smell like a funeral parlour. Hanaud nodded, not as one who had been enlightened, but as one who had had a minor absurdity confirmed. So you moved the bowl? No. Who did? I don't know. You left it in the hall after experimenting upon it? Yes. And told no one? No. Because? Because Mrs. Whitstable would have thrown me out of the house. On that, said Hanaud, I am wholly with her. There was another pause. The sea continued its private business with the shore. Fielding said suddenly, "I didn't kill Sir Henry." "No, no. Yet you have concealed a cigarette case, lied about a purchase, and taken upon yourself the protection of a young woman who has not asked for it. These are not the actions of a wise innocent." "I didn't say I was wise." "No," said Hanaud. "That, at least, has the authority of evidence." The young man gave a short, miserable laugh, and then, quite unexpectedly, his shoulders loosened as though the laugh had broken something more useful than dignity. "I thought," he said, "that if the police found the case in Madame d'Auvergne's room and then discovered Alice had quarrelled with her before dinner, they would make a whole melodrama of it. Alice had enough to bear." "Ah," said Hanaud. That was all he said, but it was enough to make Fielding look at him sharply. "You knew there had been a quarrel?" "I know there was a conversation. Whether it rose to the dignity of a quarrel, I have not yet decided. It was about Sir Henry." "Of course. You know a great deal." Hanaud spread his hands. "I know fragments. It is my misfortune to collect them before they have the politeness to arrange themselves." He moved away from the balustrade. "One last question, monsieur. When you ran to the lower terrace after Miss Harding screamed, did you see anyone upon the upper floor, at a window, in a corridor?" Fielding frowned. "No. Only—" "Yes? I thought I heard a door shut upstairs just as I reached the steps, but that may have been from the servants' passage." "Everything may be from the servants' passage," said Hanaud. "It is one of the privileges of service. Good night, Monsieur Fielding. You have been foolish, but perhaps not fatally so." Fielding hesitated. "Will you tell Alice?" "I tell people only what is necessary. It is a habit which disappoints them equally, whether they are guilty or in love." Fielding made as if to say more, then thought better of it, and went quickly back towards the hotel. Hanaud remained upon the terrace for some moments after he had gone. At length he drew the cigarette case from his pocket again, held it under the lamp, and turned it over in his fingers. Then, with the air of a man whose evening has at last produced something worth carrying away, he slipped it back into his pocket and walked towards the house by the garden path instead of the main door. Mr. Ricardo emerged from behind the palms with some stiffness in the knees and a very active mind. He had reached the first turn of the path before he realized that another figure had been standing all the while in the deeper shadow beyond the lamp. It was Lady Hatherley. She stepped forward as quietly as a thought one had hoped not to think again. "You may as well stop pretending, Mr. Ricardo," she said. "You were never concealed for a moment." Ricardo, who disliked being detected almost as much as he enjoyed observing, murmured something about the night air. "Yes," said Lady Hatherley. "It appears to agree with conspiracies." She glanced towards the path Hanaud had taken. "Did the young man tell him the truth?" "My dear Lady Hatherley, I have no notion." "Then you are more fortunate than I am," she said. "I am beginning to suspect that everyone in this affair has told the truth, only not about the same thing." She turned and went in, leaving Mr. Ricardo with the uncomfortable impression that, in this house and hotel full of people preserving one another's reputations, truth had become not a lantern but a set of mirrors. And mirrors, as he had always thought, were awkward things to meet at night. The following morning at the villa, Mirabel had that air of offended propriety which large houses assume after scandal. Shutters were opened at the usual hour. Gravel was raked as though nothing of consequence had ever lain upon it. Coffee appeared upon trays with the reproachful punctuality of a servant class which has no intention of allowing murder to interfere with breakfast. Inspector Hanaud, who distrusted houses when they resumed discipline too quickly, asked to see M. Brochet. Brochet was in the lower garden by the fountain, engaged in the obscure and patient rites by which old gardeners contrive to make goldfish appear both ornamental and moral. He was a square, sunburnt man with forearms like knotted rope, and a face which suggested that, if he had ever expected life to be reasonable, he had abandoned the expectation at some point before the war. He touched the brim of his cap. "Monsieur, Good morning, M. Brochet. Your fish flourish. They do not concern themselves with society, monsieur. It helps. Hanaud glanced down into the fountain, where 3 sluggish gold bodies turned in the green water with the self-importance of people who had inherited a small town. Would that more people possessed their discretion? You were in the garden yesterday before dinner? All day, monsieur. And in the lower terrace before the guests sat down? Yes. Did you, by any chance, see a bowl of tuberoses brought here? Brochet's face did not alter. It merely became, by some old trick of peasant reserve, less available. Yes, monsieur. Mr. Ricardo, standing a little aside beneath the cypress, experienced that small internal shock which accompanies the discovery that an apparently decorative question has bitten. You brought them yourself? Said Hanaud. Yes, monsieur. From the hall? Yes. At whose instruction? Brochet hesitated. He was not a liar by temperament. He was merely a man who believed that employers had a right to their domestic absurdities, provided they did not extend to the kitchen garden. Mademoiselle Clavering asked it. Ah, said Hanaud softly. And at what hour? Perhaps 7:15, a little later. Before dinner? Yes, monsieur. And where did you place them? Brochet pointed with one thick finger to the spot beside the fountain where Miss Harding had found the body and the flowers together. There, in the shade. Mademoiselle said the smell in the hall had become impossible. Impossible? Brochet permitted himself the faintest shrug. Somebody had poured scent on them, monsieur. Too much. It was like the chapel at a wedding, where the bride's family are uncertain whether to rejoice. Hanaud's pale eyes brightened. That is a most exact distinction, M. Brochet. And you said nothing of this to the brigadier. He did not ask me about flowers. He asked me about bodies. And you supposed the flowers irrelevant. I am a gardener, monsieur. I know that flowers are rarely irrelevant, but I did not suppose they had killed the gentleman. Mr. Ricardo, despite himself, coughed. Hanaud was delighted. My dear Brochet, he said, if you continue to reason like this, the police will become unnecessary, and all Europe will relapse into decency. Tell me one more thing. Why did Mademoiselle Clavering ask you, and not a servant? Brochet scraped one boot on the gravel. Because she was embarrassed. For herself? For the young Englishman. Mr. Fielding. Yes, monsieur. He had perfumed the flowers? I did not see him do it, but Mademoiselle said, Mr. Fielding has been idiotic, and my aunt must not know it before dinner. Those were her words. Hanaud bowed gravely, as if receiving testimony in court, and being a gentleman of sentiment, you obeyed. I am a gardener, monsieur. Sentiment is for the roses, but Mademoiselle has always spoken civilly to me. There was a pause in which the fountain murmured to itself, and one of the goldfish rose, as though hoping that at last someone intended to discuss matters of genuine importance. Then Hanaud said, very gently, What else did you not say, M. Brochet? The gardener looked up sharply. I have told the truth. I do not dispute it, but truth in households of this kind seldom travels alone. It is usually attended by a cousin who has been left at the gate. Brochet frowned, considered, and then nodded once, like a man deciding that the weather could not be improved by silence. When I came back from the hall with the bowl, he said, I heard voices above, from the blue room, the room with the green shutter. Yes, monsieur. A man and a woman? Yes. Could you distinguish words? No, only tone. The lady was angry but quiet. The gentleman quiet also. English quiet, not French quiet. Mr. Ricardo, who had never heard national temperaments arranged so efficiently, stored this away with interest. And afterwards? Asked Hanaud. Afterwards, nothing. I went to my shed. Then later, I heard the scream. Did you see anyone leave the blue room? No, monsieur. Did you see Sir Henry enter the garden? No. Did you see Madame d'Auvergne at any time after dinner began? No. Brochet's answers were plain enough to be disappointing which is often the mark of useful ones. Hanaud thanked him, touched his hat, and walked with Ricardo towards the upper terrace. "Well," said Ricardo after a few moments, "that disposes of the flowers. Entirely. And of Fielding's absurd purchase. No, my friend, it disposes only of one use of it. There remains the bottle in Madame d'Auvergne's dressing case, which is absent, and the atomizer, which has not yet had the courtesy to present itself. In these matters, one must not celebrate too soon. But yes, the flowers beside the body were not an offering, nor a message, nor a theatrical flourish. They were already there. So Miss Harding's grave arrangement was an innocent eye making poetry out of coincidence. It is a common vice. They had reached the upper terrace. Beyond the balustrade, the sea was flat and implausibly blue. In the drawing-room, a piano was being shut with that deliberate finality, which in country houses usually means that someone has failed at Schubert. Alice Clavering was alone near the long window, sorting a pile of unanswered notes with the expression of a woman who would have preferred hard labor to correspondence. She looked up as they entered, saw at once from Hanaud's face that something had altered, and put the notes aside. "Monsieur? Mademoiselle," said Hanaud, "M. Brochet has saved you the trouble of a confession." She went very still. "About the flowers?" "About the flowers." Colour rose in her face, not brilliantly, but with that sober reluctance which often accompanies humiliation more than guilt. "I ought to have told you." "Yes. I thought it ridiculous." "It was ridiculous. That is why it mattered. Ridiculous things are the first to be concealed and the last to be understood." Alice gave a short breath which might, in another room and another week, have become laughter. Mr. Fielding had poured scent over them in the afternoon. He had some theory about reviving cut flowers. They smelt appalling. Just before dinner, I noticed it and sent Brochet to take them out. I did not want my aunt to know, because she would have been furious, and Mr. Fielding would have been made absurd. "My dear mademoiselle," said Hanaud, "young men are made absurd by nature. It is one of the ways by which society survives them. Still, I understand." She looked away towards the terrace. "I did not see, then, that it would matter." "No, few people do when they begin protecting one another from small embarrassments. It is only later that the whole house fills with little acts of charity, and one finds oneself knee-deep in confusion." Ricardo, who thought this an excellent description of most marriages, remained tactfully silent. Hanaud moved a little nearer. "There is another matter. Before dinner, in the hall, you spoke with Madame d'Auvergne." Alice hesitated. "Yes." "She told you something?" "Yes." "Something concerning Sir Henry." A longer pause followed. Outside, somewhere below, a gardener shut a gate with more force than elegance. "At dinner?" Alice said at last. "She told me Sir Henry wished to speak with me privately after the meal." Hanaud did not move. "And did you agree?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I did not know why he wished to." "And because Madame d'Auvergne did not advise it." "She advised against it?" "Yes." "Strongly?" Alice folded and unfolded one of the notes upon the table. "She said he had no right to ask it." "That is a very interesting phrase." "I thought so too." "You asked her what she meant?" "She said, 'I mean what I say.'" "And you were angry?" "Yes." "With her?" "With both of them. With everyone, in fact." "An excellent condition for dinner," murmured Hanaud. Alice lifted her eyes to his. "I am telling you the truth." "I know. The difficulty, mademoiselle, is that everyone now seems to be." He took up his hat. At the door he paused and looked back, not at Alice, but at the table where her unanswered notes lay in a careful heap. "One final point. After Madame d'Auvergne told you this, did you see Sir Henry again before the scream?" Alice shook her head. "No." Hanaud inclined his head and went out. On the terrace, Ricardo said, "Then Sir Henry wanted a private interview with Miss Clavering, and Madame d'Auvergne objected." Yes. Why? Hanaud looked down towards the lower garden, where the bowl of tuberoses no longer stood. My friend, he said, for the first time in this affair, I begin to suspect that the dead man's intentions may be more compromising than his death. And because Hanaud had said it in that mild voice, which usually meant he was thinking several thoughts at once and sharing none of them whole, Mr. Ricardo felt again that peculiar impatience which his friend inspired in him more reliably than admiration, though not more permanently. Below them the fountain went on with its small, impartial trickle, as if in a house full of withheld explanations it had at least the decency to sound exactly like itself. Inspector Hanaud spent the greater part of the afternoon in committing what Mrs. Whitstable described, with faint alarm, as small domestic tyrannies. He moved chairs, he altered a tea-table, he requested, with grave courtesy and absolute firmness, that the striped awning on the upper terrace be left half-drawn, though the sun made nonsense of comfort. He asked Jules to lay cups for 7, then for 8, then, after an interval of reflection, for 9. He sent M. Brochet to fetch 2 pots of rosemary from the kitchen garden and place them, for no reason anyone could detect, beside the steps to the lower terrace. He even caused the green shutter of the blue bedroom to be left precisely as it was broken, ajar and irritating. These arrangements, said Mrs. Whitstable, watching him from the drawing-room window with that expression, hostesses reserve for clergymen and plumbers, appear to be symbolic. My dear madame, said Hanaud, who was placing a small round table exactly where no one would willingly sit beside it. All arrangements are symbolic. That is why they matter. A dinner table is an argument in wood. A drawing-room is a confession in chairs. Mr. Ricardo, to whom this was said as though it explained everything, refrained from answering. By 6 o'clock, the invited company had assembled. Sir George and Lady Hatherley came from the Hôtel du Cap with the promptness of people trained by timetables. Miss Harding came because not to come would have seemed an admission of nerves, and also because she had never in her life knowingly missed the centre of an event. Lawrence Fielding came looking much more prepared for discomfort than he had any right to be in white flannels. Alice Clavering was already in the house, and Mrs. Whitstable, who had invited them all with the calm of a woman issuing cards for a garden fête, received each arrival with impeccable civility and the air of having mislaid her astonishment somewhere before luncheon. They were taken not to the drawing-room, as several had expected, but to the upper terrace overlooking the garden. The chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle facing the villa rather than the sea, which at once gave the whole proceeding the faintly embarrassing character of an audience that had arrived without being told what it was to watch. The little round table stood near the steps to the lower terrace. On it, quite solitary, lay Sir Henry Prior's silver cigarette case. Fielding saw it first and stopped. Mrs. Whitstable's eyebrows rose by perhaps half an inch. Miss Harding made a small movement with her parasol, as though hoping it might serve as moral protection. Hanaud waited until they were all seated. He himself remained standing, with his back to the balustrade and his hands folded before him, a large, dark, courteous figure against the light. My friends, he said, I have asked you here because this affair has suffered from the beginning, not from malice, though there may have been enough of that, but from kindness. One person has wished to spare another embarrassment, then a second has wished to spare the first, then a third has wished to spare them both. It is a generous instinct. It is also, for the police, a disease. Sir George cleared his throat in a martial manner. Are we to understand, Inspector, that this is an inquiry? No, Sir George. You are to understand that it is tea. Inquiry is less comfortable and much less civilized. Jules, if you please. Jules emerged, distributed cups with the dignity of a diplomat managing a minor treaty, and withdrew. When the last spoon had sounded in the last cup, Hanaud said, Let us begin with the tuberoses, because they have made more trouble than they deserved. The flowers found beside Sir Henry Prior's body were not placed there after his death by any hand seeking poetry, sentiment, or concealment. They were in that position before dinner. There was a distinct pause. Miss Harding, who had built a good deal upon the arrangement of those flowers, looked at once offended and relieved. Hanaud bowed to Alice. Mademoiselle Clavering, out of charity towards Monsieur Fielding, caused them to be removed from the hall because Monsieur Fielding, in an excess of artistic enterprise, had drenched them with scent. Fielding coloured. Mrs. Whitstable closed her eyes for one moment only. "My dear Lawrence," she said, opening them again, "that is exactly the sort of thing I had always feared from painters." "I am not," said Fielding miserably, "strictly speaking." "No," said Lady Hatherley, with calm. "We had all arrived at that." A small, unwilling laugh moved around the terrace and, with it, some of the tightness in the air. Hanaud let it pass. "This matters," he continued, "because the flowers cease to accuse Madame d'Auvergne, and Monsieur Fielding ceases to be a theatrical murderer. For this, I think we may all be grateful." He picked up the silver cigarette case and turned it once between his fingers. "Now, to a second kindness. Monsieur Fielding found this in the blue bedroom and concealed it, again out of charity, this time towards Mademoiselle Clavering." Quote. Alice turned sharply. "Toward me?" Fielding looked as though he would have preferred a fall from the terrace. "Yes," said Hanaud gently, "because he believed your conversation with Madame d'Auvergne before dinner might be given a significance it did not deserve. You see, mademoiselle, you have inspired protection as naturally as some women inspire gossip." Mrs. Whitstable set down her cup. "Monsieur Hanaud," she said, "if you are in the habit of conducting tea as a distributive exercise in humiliation, I ought to have ordered stronger cake." "Madame," said Hanaud, inclining his head, "you speak with your usual justice, but we are nearing the point." He slipped the cigarette case into his pocket and, instead of continuing at once, walked over to the little round table by the steps. From it he took not a paper, as Ricardo had half expected, but a room key upon a blue silk tag. "The key of the blue bedroom," he said. "I have spent 2 days thinking of that room as Madame d'Auvergne's room. This was a mistake. It was only lent to Madame d'Auvergne for the night. Before that, for years. Was it not so, madame? The room belonged to someone else." Mrs. Whitstable's face, which had remained admirably composed through flowers, cigarette cases, and painters, altered at last. It did not collapse. She was too practiced for that. But something in it withdrew from the company, as if a blind had been lowered behind the eyes. "It had once been my sister's room," she said. No one spoke. "The sea below went on glittering with indecent serenity," Hanaud said, in the tone of a man placing a cup carefully upon a saucer. "Exactly. Your sister's room." "And Sir Henry Prior knew that." Miss Harding looked from one face to another with the painful alertness of a woman who has just realized that the true conversation began some time ago and has been proceeding without her. Lady Hatherley, who missed little, leaned back in her chair and regarded Hanaud over steepled fingers. "So the room mattered before Madame d'Auvergne ever entered it?" "Yes. And Sir Henry's presence there was not necessarily for Madame d'Auvergne." "No." Alice had grown very white. "My mother's room?" she said quietly. Mrs. Whitstable turned towards her niece, and for the first time since the affair began, the assurance of the hostess left her altogether. "Alice." But Hanaud lifted one hand, not to silence her, only to delay. "My dear young lady," he said, "there is one thing only which need concern us at this moment, that several behaviours in this house, which have seemed suspicious, are now merely sad. Madame d'Auvergne objected to an interview. Monsieur Fielding tried to protect you from its consequences. Your aunt attempted to preserve the ordinary forms of life, while the extraordinary intruded. All this, I understand. What I do not yet wholly understand is why Sir Henry Prior chose that evening to revive an old claim upon a room, a family, and a young lady who had not invited him to any of the three. Sir George shifted in his chair. "Claim?" he repeated. Before Hanaud could answer, Jules appeared in the doorway of the drawing-room. Even at that distance, one could see that something had occurred sufficient to disturb the ceremonial flatness of his expression. He crossed the terrace to Mrs. Whitstable and spoke in a low voice. Mrs. Whitstable rose at once. "Will you show her here?" she said. Fielding stood up. Alice did not move. Hanaud, who had not seemed surprised, turned very slightly towards the steps from the house. A moment later, Madame d'Auvergne came out onto the terrace. She was dressed in travelling black, her hat still on, and she looked not like a fugitive returning, but like a woman who had been kept waiting by incompetent arrangements and had decided, at last, to deal with the matter herself. In one gloved hand she carried a small leather case. In the other, quite openly and without flourish, she carried a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. She looked first at Mrs. Whitstable, then at Alice, and then directly at Inspector Hanaud. "Monsieur," she said, "I find that your police are very slow. It was simpler to come back." The terrace, which for several minutes had contained only discomfort, now contained expectation as well. And expectation, Mr. Ricardo thought, was always the less manageable guest. Inspector Hanaud spent the greater part of the afternoon in committing what Mrs. Whitstable described, with faint alarm, as small domestic tyrannies. He moved chairs. He altered a tea table. He requested, with grave courtesy and absolute firmness, that the striped awning on the upper terrace be left half-drawn, though the sun made nonsense of comfort. He asked Jules to lay cups for 7, then for 8, then, after an interval of reflection, for 9. He sent M. Brochet to fetch 2 pots of rosemary from the kitchen garden and place them, for no reason anyone could detect, beside the steps to the lower terrace. He even caused the green shutter of the blue bedroom to be left precisely as it was broken, ajar and irritating. "These arrangements," said Mrs. Whitstable, watching him from the drawing-room window with that expression hostesses reserve for clergymen and plumbers, "appear to be symbolic." "My dear madame," said Hanaud, who was placing a small round table exactly where no one would willingly sit beside it, "all arrangements are symbolic. That is why they matter. A dinner table is an argument in wood. A drawing-room is a confession in chairs." Mr. Ricardo, to whom this was said as though it explained everything, refrained from answering. By 6 o'clock the invited company had assembled. Sir George and Lady Hatherley came from the Hôtel du Cap with the promptness of people trained by timetables. Miss Harding came because not to come would have seemed an admission of nerves, and also because she had never in her life knowingly missed the centre of an event. Lawrence Fielding came looking much more prepared for discomfort than he had any right to be in white flannels. Alice Clavering was already in the house, and Mrs. Whitstable, who had invited them all with the calm of a woman issuing cards for a garden fete, received each arrival with impeccable civility and the air of having mislaid her astonishment somewhere before luncheon. They were taken not to the drawing-room, as several had expected, but to the upper terrace overlooking the garden. The chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle facing the villa rather than the sea, which at once gave the whole proceeding the faintly embarrassing character of an audience that had arrived without being told what it was to watch. The little round table stood near the steps to the lower terrace. On it, quite solitary, lay Sir Henry Prior's silver cigarette case. Fielding saw it first and stopped. Mrs. Whitstable's eyebrows rose by perhaps half an inch. Miss Harding made a small movement with her parasol, as though hoping it might serve as moral protection. Hanaud waited until they were all seated. He himself remained standing, with his back to the balustrade and his hands folded before him, a large, dark, courteous figure against the light. "My friends," he said, "I have asked you here because this affair has suffered, from the beginning, not from malice, though there may have been enough of that, but from kindness. One person has wished to spare another embarrassment, then a second has wished to spare the first, then a third has wished to spare them both. It is a generous instinct. It is also, for the police, a disease. Sir George cleared his throat in a martial manner. Are we to understand, Inspector, that this is an inquiry? No, Sir George. You are to understand that it is tea. Inquiry is less comfortable and much less civilized. Jules, if you please. Jules emerged, distributed cups with the dignity of a diplomat managing a minor treaty, and withdrew. When the last spoon had sounded in the last cup, Hanaud said, "Let us begin with the tuberoses, because they have made more trouble than they deserved." The flowers found beside Sir Henry Prior's body were not placed there after his death by any hand seeking poetry, sentiment, or concealment. They were in that position before dinner. There was a distinct pause. Miss Harding, who had built a good deal upon the arrangement of those flowers, looked at once offended and relieved. Hanaud bowed to Alice. Mademoiselle Clavering, out of charity towards Monsieur Fielding, caused them to be removed from the hall because Monsieur Fielding, in an excess of artistic enterprise, had drenched them with scent. Fielding coloured. Mrs. Whitstable closed her eyes for one moment only. "My dear Lawrence," she said, opening them again, "that is exactly the sort of thing I had always feared from painters." "I am not," said Fielding miserably, "strictly speaking." "No," said Lady Hatherley, with calm. "We had all arrived at that." A small unwilling laugh moved around the terrace and, with it, some of the tightness in the air. Hanaud let it pass. "This matters," he continued, "because the flowers cease to accuse Madame d'Auvergne, and Monsieur Fielding ceases to be a theatrical murderer. For this I think we may all be grateful." He picked up the silver cigarette case and turned it once between his fingers. "Now to a second kindness. Monsieur Fielding found this in the blue bedroom and concealed it, again out of charity, this time towards Mademoiselle Clavering." Alice turned sharply. "Toward me?" Fielding looked as though he would have preferred a fall from the terrace. "Yes," said Hanaud gently. "Because he believed your conversation with Madame d'Auvergne before dinner might be given a significance it did not deserve. You see, mademoiselle, you have inspired protection as naturally as some women inspire gossip." Mrs. Whitstable set down her cup. "Monsieur Hanaud," she said, "if you are in the habit of conducting tea as a distributive exercise in humiliation, I ought to have ordered stronger cake." "Madame," said Hanaud, inclining his head, "you speak with your usual justice, but we are nearing the point." He slipped the cigarette case into his pocket and, instead of continuing at once, walked over to the little round table by the steps. From it he took not a paper, as Ricardo had half expected, but a room key upon a blue silk tag. "The key of the blue bedroom," he said. "I have spent 2 days thinking of that room as Madame d'Auvergne's room. This was a mistake. It was only lent to Madame d'Auvergne for the night. Before that, for years, was it not so, madame? The room belonged to someone else." Mrs. Whitstable's face, which had remained admirably composed through flowers, cigarette cases, and painters, altered at last. It did not collapse. She was too practiced for that. But something in it withdrew from the company, as if a blind had been lowered behind the eyes. "It had once been my sister's room," she said. No one spoke. "The sea below went on glittering with indecent serenity," Hanaud said, in the tone of a man placing a cup carefully upon a saucer. "Exactly. Your sister's room, and Sir Henry Prior knew that." Miss Harding looked from one face to another with the painful alertness of a woman who has just realized that the true conversation began some time ago and has been proceeding without her. Lady Hatherley, who missed little, leaned back in her chair and regarded Hanaud over steepled fingers. "So the room mattered before Madame d'Auvergne ever entered it?" "Yes. And Sir Henry's presence there was not necessarily for Madame d'Auvergne?" "No." Alice had grown very white. "My mother's room?" she said quietly. Mrs. Whitstable turned towards her niece and for the first time since the affair began, the assurance of the hostess left her altogether. Alice. But Hanaud lifted one hand, not to silence her, only to delay. "My dear young lady," he said, "there is one thing only which need concern us at this moment, that several behaviors in this house, which have seemed suspicious, are now merely sad. Madame d'Auvergne objected to an interview. Monsieur Fielding tried to protect you from its consequences. Your aunt attempted to preserve the ordinary forms of life, while the extraordinary intruded. All this I understand. What I do not yet wholly understand is why Sir Henry Prior chose that evening to revive an old claim upon a room, a family, and a young lady who had not invited him to any of the three." Sir George shifted in his chair. "Claim?" he repeated. Before Hanaud could answer, Jules appeared in the doorway of the drawing-room. Even at that distance, one could see that something had occurred sufficient to disturb the ceremonial flatness of his expression. He crossed the terrace to Mrs. Whitstable and spoke in a low voice. Mrs. Whitstable rose at once. "Will you show her here?" she said. Fielding stood up. Alice did not move. Hanaud, who had not seemed surprised, turned very slightly towards the steps from the house. A moment later, Madame d'Auvergne came out onto the terrace. She was dressed in travelling black, her hat still on, and she looked not like a fugitive returning, but like a woman who had been kept waiting by incompetent arrangements and had decided, at last, to deal with the matter herself. In one gloved hand, she carried a small leather case. In the other, quite openly and without flourish, she carried a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. She looked first at Mrs. Whitstable, then at Alice, and then directly at Inspector Hanaud. "Monsieur," she said, "I find that your police are very slow. It was simpler to come back." The terrace, which for several minutes had contained only discomfort, now contained expectation as well. And expectation, Mr. Ricardo thought, was always the less manageable guest. Madame d'Auvergne came to the empty chair beside Lady Hatherley and remained standing behind it, as though unwilling, for the moment, to accept the hospitality of a house which had almost certainly expected never to see her again. The letters in her hand were old. One could tell it from the way the ribbon had flattened with years into the paper, and from the small, careful economy with which she held them. Mrs. Whitstable said, in a voice which had become very quiet, "You have brought those?" "Yes," replied Madame d'Auvergne, "at last, since everyone insists upon taking the long road." Hanaud bowed. "Madame, if I may, before you speak, I should like to arrange what is already known. Afterwards, you will correct me where I fail. It is the privilege of witnesses to improve the police." Madame d'Auvergne looked at him for a moment, then sat down. "As you please, monsieur." Hanaud did not return to the balustrade. He remained among them, one hand resting lightly upon the back of a chair, as though what he was about to say belonged less to inquiry than to company. "Sir Henry Prior came to this house," he began, "not merely as a dinner guest. He came with an intention. It concerned Mademoiselle Clavering, and it concerned the blue bedroom which had once belonged to her mother." Alice did not move. Only her fingers tightened, once, upon the arm of her chair. "Years ago," Hanaud continued, "there was an understanding between Sir Henry Prior and Mrs. Whitstable's sister. The understanding was of the kind which men often remember as romance and women as damage. Madame d'Auvergne knew of it then. Mrs. Whitstable knew of it later. And Sir Henry, after many years of behaving as though the matter had been conveniently buried, discovered that time has the vulgar habit of returning with interest." Madame d'Auvergne gave a small sound, half contempt, half assent. "The letters," said Hanaud, inclining his head towards the bundle, "are his. They establish what he promised, what he withdrew, and what claim he had long ago forfeited to decent silence. Recently, however, Sir Henry had reasons for revisiting the past." "His bank?" said Lady Hatherley quietly. Hanaud turned to her. "Precisely, madam. His affairs were unsound. He required money, influence, some leverage over fate. He remembered, perhaps, that there was a young lady in the world whom he had never acknowledged, and over whom he imagined, in the selfish mathematics of elderly men, that he might suddenly exert authority. Alice drew breath, but said nothing. "He proposed," said Madame d'Auvergne sharply, to tell her, as though paternity were a valise one may unpack after 20 years and expect gratitude. Mrs. Whitstable closed her eyes for an instant. "You knew this?" asked Alice, turning to her aunt. "No," said Mrs. Whitstable. "Not until yesterday." Madame d'Auvergne leaned forward. "He wrote to me first," she said. "He knew I had some of the letters. He wished them returned. He said he intended to put matters in order. I knew what that meant. Men always use orderly phrases when preparing a cruelty. And so," said Hanaud, "you came to the Villa Mirabelle. You warned Mademoiselle Clavering that Sir Henry wished to speak with her privately. You told her he had no right." "Yes. And then, after he left the table, you followed him upstairs to the blue bedroom." Madame d'Auvergne lifted her chin. "Yes." Sir George shifted in his chair, his moustache bristling at truth now that it had become irretrievable. "The voices," he muttered. "The voices," said Hanaud. Miss Harding heard a woman say no. Brochet heard anger. Monsieur Fielding found Sir Henry's cigarette case on the rug. All this belongs to the same interview. Sir Henry had gone to the old room because he believed there were papers still hidden there, or because he wished to trade upon the room's associations. It was a sentimental choice, and therefore indecent. Madame d'Auvergne said, with that dry bitterness which had always sat oddly well upon her laughter, "He said he meant to tell the girl the truth. I said the truth had missed its proper season." "And the knife?" asked Sir George. Madame d'Auvergne looked at him almost lazily. "I took it from the table before I followed him. One does not always trust elderly bankers to remain rhetorical." Miss Harding gave a tiny gasp, which she disguised as interest in her tea. "I put it down on the dressing table," Madame d'Auvergne went on. He was insolent. "I preferred not to hold steel while listening to him. He said I was melodramatic. It was one of the few accurate remarks he ever made." "And you left him there?" Hanaud asked. "Yes. I went to the music room. I wanted not to be seen for a few minutes." Hanaud nodded. "That is believed already. Several people found you there. So you did not kill him, madame. But you did, without knowing it, leave behind two things of use to another person: the knife and the knowledge of what Sir Henry intended." His gaze moved, not abruptly, but with the terrible gentleness of certainty, to Mrs. Whitstable. No one else spoke. The sea below the terrace had changed colour with the declining light. The glitter had gone out of it. In its place there was a long, level grey, as though the bay had at last grown serious. "My dear madame," said Hanaud, "when you could not find Madame d'Auvergne in the drawing-room, you looked for her upstairs. You reached the blue bedroom after she had gone, and before Sir Henry had left it. You heard enough. Perhaps he spoke plainly. Perhaps more plainly than a man of breeding should ever speak of a dead woman and a living girl. You took the knife from the dressing-table. You followed him down into the garden. There, beside the tuberoses, you asked him to leave your niece in peace." Mrs. Whitstable sat very upright, her hands folded together with the exactness of a woman who has spent a lifetime controlling objects when people became impossible. Alice whispered, "Aunt Celia." Mrs. Whitstable did not look at her. "He laughed," she said. No one moved. "He said peace was an expensive luxury. He said Alice had what he required and that he was, after all, her father." The last word lay upon the terrace like something dropped and breakable. Fielding stared at the floor. Lady Hatherley lowered her eyes. Miss Harding, for once in her life, had no expression available to her at all. "I told him," said Mrs. Whitstable, still in the same quiet voice, "that if he had wished to be her father, he had had 23 years in which to attempt it. He said a great many disagreeable things, some about my sister, some about money. Then he turned towards the house." "And you stopped him?" said Hanaud. Yes. It was not said bravely. It was said as one confirms the weather. He pulled away. I was still holding the knife. He twisted. It went in. I do not know precisely how. I only remember that he looked surprised, which irritated me. Then he fell among those wretched flowers. Alice had risen now and was standing beside her aunt's chair, though she had not yet touched it. "Why did you say nothing?" she asked. Mrs. Whitstable gave a short breath, which was almost a laugh and altogether miserable. "My dear, because one cannot ring the bell and announce before dessert that one has stabbed the principal guest in the lower garden." It was Lady Hatherley who answered that, with the smallest nod. "No," she said, "one cannot." The quiet of the terrace altered. It was no longer the embarrassed quiet of a social scene gone wrong. It was the heavier, more human quiet in which a room full of people recognizes that one among them has passed in a single minute beyond the protection of manners. Hanaud spoke very gently. "You intended to prevent, not to kill, and afterwards, madame, you preserved order because order was the only thing left to preserve. I understand." Mrs. Whitstable looked at him directly. "Will the law?" Hanaud spread his hands. "The law, madame, is often less imaginative than justice and rather more noisy. But it has, in France, a certain respect for provocation, for a woman defending the peace of her house, and for old men who attempt extortion under the sentimental disguise of conscience." Madame d'Auvergne untied the ribbon from the letters. "These will help it to understand," she said, "though I do not promise they will improve its temper." She handed the packet, not to Hanaud, but to Alice. "They were your mother's. They concern you more than any magistrate." Alice took them without looking down. For the first time since Madame d'Auvergne had returned, Mrs. Whitstable turned towards her niece. There was no self-dramatization in her face now, only fatigue and something sterner than affection. "I am sorry," she said. Alice stood for a moment with the letters in her hand. Then she bent and laid her hand upon her aunt's shoulder with a simplicity more moving than any embrace. "So am I," she said. It was, Mr. Ricardo thought, one of those replies which contain far more than agreement. Later, when the necessary private arrangements had been set in motion, and Sir George had gone off to write down facts in the tone of a campaign report, and Miss Harding had been tactfully removed by Lady Hatherley before curiosity could harden again into narrative, Hanaud and Ricardo walked for a little way along the path above Cap Ferrat. The tide was turning below the rocks. One could hear it in the slow inward drag of the pebbles, patient and repetitive, as though the sea had undertaken, in its immense discretion, to erase without hurrying. Ricardo said, after a time, "You knew it was Mrs. Whitstable before Madame d'Auvergne returned?" "Yes." "From the beginning?" "My friend, from the beginning I knew only that too many people were protecting the wrong details. But when the flowers ceased to mean anything, and the cigarette case began to mean something, the shape of the matter changed. One saw then that the quarrel upstairs explained the motive, but not the death. For the death one required another person, someone with authority in the house, someone who would think first not of escape, but of napkins, telegrams, and the doctor." Ricardo reflected. "She did that extremely well." "Yes," said Hanaud. "That is why I distrusted it. Real innocence is often untidy." They walked on a few steps more. "And Alice?" Ricardo asked. Hanaud looked out over the darkening water. "She will learn. She will suffer, and she will probably become wiser than is good for youth. But she has an aunt who loved her, a dead man who no longer troubles her, and a packet of letters which may at least teach her not to be impressed by male repentance when it arrives too late." Ricardo sighed. "You make it sound almost educational." "My dear friend," said Hanaud, with the faintest shadow of his old smile, "most tragedies in good society are educational. It is only that the fees are so disproportionately high." Below them, the tide continued its careful work among the stones.